Sumay was a very special village in terms of what it offered the people who lived there. It was their home, it was their place of worship, it was where their cemetery was, so from birth to death, all your food was there, your farming, your fishing, it was self-contained.
Sumay was our town. Everybody talks about Sumay. It was beautiful. People were happy, and if you ever travel to Sumay and see the what's down there, the beach. Look at Gap. You been to Gap Gap? That alone, boy, will tell you how we miss Sumay. There's everything there. Fish. They got all the fish in the world, man. It was a beautiful town. I was a young kid, but I'll never forget it. I love it.
Well, Sumay is one of the villages that we do take the time to think about and talk about. There are many villages on the island, of course, and throughout the archipelago, but Sumay has a particular history in the ways that the colonizers have interacted with it or used it.
For most of the villagers on Guam, you had your home in the village where the church was and the school was, but in addition to your home, you had a ranch, the Chamorros called the Lantsu, and then you also had fishing grounds. But what makes Sumay unique is that for the people who lived there, it was all three in one.
The bombs came around December, I believe it was December 8, 1941. It was a holiday and there was no school. We heard this huge explosion and it just shook the house. Everything on the table spilled over, my milk, their coffee and everything. And so we didn't know what was happening, so we all got up and ran to the ports. And the one thing I remember clearly is people were running and screaming. I mean, they were carrying all kinds of stuff, they're dragging their children, and you knew something was terribly wrong.
World War II on Guam began in December 1941. The Japanese occupied the island. In their mind, they conquered the island, they colonized it, it was theirs. They even renamed Guam. Guam was now Omiyajima. They renamed all of the villages. For the Chamorros, of course, it was a time, generally speaking, remembered in terms of fear, trauma, all kinds of abuses, from massacres, the many accounts of rapes and other forms of abuse. Not every Chamorro experienced this, but it was widespread enough that among the general public, the war is remembered as a very difficult time.
It was like dealing with, planes bombing and shooting, and that you're strafing the roads and people being shot up, and that your church was changed to a military station, that your house was being occupied by soldiers. Some of the houses in Sumay were being used for comfort women. Sumay would be my ancestral lands, both maternal and paternal. My heritage, my identity is very much rooted in a village that ceased to exist.
The Sumay people were driven out of Sumay, not to be allowed to return. So we ended up, it's called Apla. That's where they settled all the Sumay people. They were living in just lean-to shacks, whatever. It was really in a very poor living condition. I witnessed beheadings, people being shot at. I actually saw a battle between a number of Marines and Japanese, and boy, I'll tell you, that was something. Talk about scary. Of course, I try to keep away from from the Japanese soldiers as much as I can, because I used to just mingle with them, and pretty soon I could hear them say, "Ah, you American boy." Boy, I just find the closest exit and made my move. We were told to march, you folks probably heard about the Meningan March. So I was, helping our grandmother, who was in her 70s at the time, sickly. And we were watched very closely by the Japanese. And word got around that there's a possibility that the Chamorros are going to be massacred, which is, boy, I'll tell you, that was really scary.
A special mass was held at the old cemetery in Sumay. Sumay now lies on naval property, but it was once a thriving village whose history dates back to the pre-Spanish ancient Chamorro era of Guam. During this American period, Sumay remained a thriving village whose population was second only to the capital of Hagatna. However, when the Japanese attacked Guam on December 8th of 1941, Sumay was heavily bombed, and the residents of the village fled to their ranches in the jungles to hide from the bombing. Then, when the U.S. liberated Guam and took control of the island, they did not allow the residents to return to Sumay. Instead, they took the property and turned it into what is now part of Naval Base Guam. The residents of Sumay were relocated to the surrounding hills, creating what is now the village of Santa Rita.
What was part of the programmatic agreement was the Historic Sites Access Plan. That's, from what I understand, is you can make a request to be able to visit these historic sites, be in the company of a representative. So there's that program. If you have someone that has military access, you can access these historic sites anytime. But other than that, there's really, this Back to Sumay event. My idea is that we, as descendants of Sumay, we have a register, and that we get a sticker that can show that we can visit all these sites. We can freely go in and out. But like any situation, if we violate our, we're in some other place, then take away the privileges. In doing this work, and the Sumay project has been, and it's going to be an ongoing thing. But we started collectively with Guampedia, with the University of Guam, with Dr. James Fairness, the MARC, the Guam Preservation Trust is really sharing the stories, getting those documented, getting those shared, and then transmitting them to the descendants of. That we have a lot of younger generations that identify themselves, I'm Tauto Sumay, or I'm a descendant of Sumay. So, and that connection to land, you can read all the books, you can watch all the films, but it can never replace getting a real sense of place, visiting the actual site.
I think a lot more about the people who were executed or who suffered during the occupation, I had fond memories when I was a young boy in Sumay, but I never thought that there's this possibility of us ever returning. I mean, we could still, like I said, we still go down and be able to visit our, the cemetery once a year, and so it's a military base now. So what else? There's no hope of the Chamorros ever returning.
Listen to the stories, and that the comments that these survivors say is that if they say we can go back right now, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna take I'm ready. And so, you know, they never wanted to let it go. Because land was sacred and land was passed on from family to family. But we have always had in our culture a very strong connection to the land.
Well, it seems to me that although it is true the original inhabitants of Sumay are of course one by one dying, it seems to me that in recent years the commemorations of Sumay have actually increased rather than decreased as their children and grandchildren have come to understand and appreciate what that was, what their loss was. And so I, being an optimist by nature, think that Sumay won't die with those inhabitants, that the children and grandchildren are carrying it on. They're not allowing it to. And if anything, they're even making it maybe a little bit more of a high profile event, history, and a place by just not wanting to forget that that's their home.